Sodom loomed on the horizon like a challenge to the heavens, a city so beautiful it seemed made of fire and gold. Its colossal walls, built with intelligence and precision, gleamed in the sunlight like burning coals, and at dusk they reflected the reddish hue of the desert, making it seem as if the city itself were burning. The walls were not merely protective barriers. They were symbols of pride, of self-sufficiency, of a false security that made the inhabitants believe nothing could ever destroy them. Each gate was made of solid wood and reinforced with iron plates, so heavy it required the strength of 6 men to open. The interior corridors allowed the guards to move nimbly, and the watchtowers rose like arrogant sentinels against the sky. To those approaching from outside, Sodom seemed invincible. But behind all that grandeur, what was hidden was something much darker, a society that had expelled God from its memory and placed man himself on the throne of good and evil. Within the walls, the city was in constant movement. Caravans from Egypt, Mesopotamia, and even more distant lands arrived daily, bringing gold, rare spices, brightly colored fabrics, and perfumes that permeated the air. The sound of flutes and drums drifted through the wide streets, mingling with the noise of the markets and the laughter of the crowds. The air was always filled with the smoke of roasting meats, freshly baked bread, and the strong smell of the bitumen that oozed from the ground and made Sodom rich. It was a place where the earth seemed to yield everything effortlessly. One only had to dig, and the bitumen gushed forth. One only had to stretch out one's hand, and riches were within reach. And when everything is easy, character is tested. In Sodom, the test was given, and pride triumphed over humility. The city's beauty was undeniable. Its buildings were adorned with polished stone and gleaming metal. The squares were decorated with statues and fountains pouring crystal-clear water, a luxury in the middle of the desert. But this beauty was a mask that hid a growing moral decay. Every street, every house, every market was imbued with a sense of invulnerability that fueled the corruption of hearts. The belief was that nothing could touch them, nothing could shatter their prosperity. And it is when a man feels untouchable that he allows himself anything. The women of Sodom were renowned for their beauty and ostentation. From childhood, they were adorned with heavy jewelry, bracelets, necklaces, and anklets that left permanent marks on their bones. With each step, their jewelry tinkled like bells, and the sound of a woman walking alone revealed her family's social standing. But vanity wasn't their only trait. They also wielded power, something unusual for the time. They could manage estates, open businesses, and even dissolve marriages. But this power, rather than being used for justice or good, became an instrument of corruption and seduction. Their clothes were made of fine, translucent fabrics, capable of passing through a ring, and when the full moon rose in the sky, they seemed made of water, reflecting the silvery light and creating a hypnotic spectacle that bewitched visitors. With each new moon, the festivities began. For weeks, the city transformed into a grand stage of celebration. The streets became torch-lit dance halls. Wine was served like water, and banquets stretched into the night. There were no laws during these days. It was as if the entire city entered a collective trance, plunging into a state where sin ceased to be something secret and became a source of pride. The music never stopped, the sound of the drums like a heartbeat in the middle of the night. Men and women indulged in pleasures without restraint, without shame, without fear. There, freedom had transformed into libertinism, and the absence of limits was celebrated as if it were a virtue. In the center of it all, the temples rose, their imposing columns seemingly touching the sky. Unlike other cities, Sodom's altars were open to allow the light of the full moon to bathe the nocturnal ceremonies. Priestesses, dressed in blue robes embroidered with silver, led the rituals with measured steps, their bodies covered in rare perfumes. The ground trembled to the sound of drums, and many believed the earth itself reacted to the acts committed there. But these were not rituals of worship of the true God, but rather celebrations of the goddess Arta, symbol of fertility and carnal passion. It was here that the sacred had been profaned, and the cult of pleasure had replaced the worship of the Creator. The justice system, which should have been a pillar of order, had become a spectacle of cruelty. The law of Sodom prohibited aid to a foreigner. Anyone who gave food or water to a stranger was dragged before the judges. These judges, 5 men in black robes decorated with gold, did not judge fairly, but with cruelty. The central courtroom, made of polished red marble, seemed imposing, but it was a stage for humiliation. The accused were forced to choose between losing everything they owned or suffering public punishment. Justice had become a theater where good was condemned and evil was exalted. One of the most memorable episodes was that of Pelatit, a young woman who dared to show compassion. Seeing a beggar dying of hunger near the city walls, she offered him bread. This act, which in any other land would be seen as a virtue, in Sodom was treated as a crime. Pelatit was condemned to a cruel death. Tied to the wall and covered in honey, she was left for insects to slowly devour her body. The population did not revolt. On the contrary, they watched the scene as if it were a spectacle, laughing and applauding as the life left the young woman's eyes. It was then that it became clear that the city had lost not only its morality, but its very humanity. While all this was happening, the sky remained silent. But this silence was not oblivion. Every act of injustice, every tear shed, every drop of innocent blood fell like an accusation before the throne of God. In the city's underground chambers, where human sacrifices were offered, the sound of drums mingled with the muffled screams of children and young people chosen for sacrifice. The black stone altar, marked by channels to drain the blood, was proof that life had lost its value and death had become ritual. With each drumbeat, the cup of divine wrath grew fuller. And yet, Sodom continued laughing, drinking, dancing, and mocking. No one regretted it. No heart was broken. It was as if the entire city was mesmerized by its own beauty, unable to see that it was heading toward the abyss. But in the sky, something was beginning to stir. The day of patience was ending. The time for warning was running out, and in the heavy silence that hung over the desert, the sentence was being sealed. The silence of the sky would not last forever. The city continued to pulse as if eternal, as if no force could stop it. But the cup of divine wrath was full, and the day of visitation approached. The last moons shone over Sodom, without anyone realizing they were farewell moons. The wind that had previously carried only the scent of spices began to blow stronger, carrying a strange sense of foreboding. But the people laughed, drank, and danced. The drums continued beating night after night, and each beat seemed to mock the sky itself. It was into this scenario that the angels descended. They didn't come with trumpets or lightning. They came disguised as travelers, as if the city had been given one last chance to show mercy. As they passed through the gates, the sound of bells rang out. To the strangers, it was a sign of welcome. To the inhabitants, it was an announcement. New prey had arrived, and soon greedy eyes began to follow them through the streets. They weren't eyes of hospitality, but of predators. It was Lot, Abraham's nephew, who found them first. His heart was already tired of living in that place, and even amidst the corruption he retained some spark of righteousness. Upon seeing them, he insisted that they come to his house. He knew what would happen if they spent the night in the square. Lot's insistence was not just courtesy, it was an act of courage, a last glimmer of kindness in a city plunged into darkness. But news of the stranger's arrival spread quickly. Within hours, a crowd gathered outside Lot's house. Men of all ages, intoxicated by desire and violence, banged on his door, demanding that he hand over the travelers. They wanted to humiliate them, rape them, and destroy what little purity had yet entered the city. Lot went out to speak to them and tried to reason with them, begging them not to commit such a crime. His voice, however, was drowned out by the laughter and shouting of the crowd. In desperation, he even offered his own daughters to protect the visitors, but the men were already blinded by sin, and nothing would stop them. It was then that the angels revealed their true identity. They opened the door, reached out, and a flash of light exploded before the crowd. Suddenly, everyone outside was blinded, groping, stumbling, and screaming in pain. The entire street was thrown into chaos. It was as if God, for a moment, had placed a veil over their eyes, saying, "Enough!" Inside the house, the mood was one of urgency. The angels spoke clearly to Lot. The time for mercy was over. The sentence had been passed. Sodom would be destroyed. He must gather his family and leave the city without delay. There was no more room for negotiation. Every minute was precious. Lot ran to warn his sons-in-law, but they mocked him, laughed at the idea of destruction, and treated the warning as a joke. And so they lost their last chance for salvation. Night wore on, and the desert wind grew stronger, as if nature itself sensed what was about to happen. As the first rays of sunlight began to tinge the horizon, the angels took Lot, his wife, and his daughters by the hand and led them out of the city. Their words were direct and terrifying. "Flee for your lives. Do not look back. Do not stop anywhere in the valley. Flee to the mountains, or you will perish." The path out of Sodom was narrow and difficult. Lot's heart pounded. Behind him, the city remained alive, noisy, unaware that these were its last moments. Each step was a mixture of relief and fear. But in his wife's heart something struggled. Every memory of the parties, the jewels, the banquets, the friends left behind, weighed like an anchor. The sound of the city echoed in her mind, calling her back. The glow of Sodom still shone in her imagination, and then came the moment that would forever mark history. She looked back. It wasn't just a curious glance, it was a look of longing, of attachment, of refusal to let go. In that instant, her body was petrified. She was transformed into a pillar of salt, an eternal monument to what happens when the heart refuses to obey God's call. Lot and his daughters couldn't stop. The warning was clear. There was no time for lamentations. They ran for the hills, while behind them something began to happen. The sky, which had been silent until then, burst into a roar. A rain of fire and brimstone began to fall from above, illuminating the dawn with a terrifying brightness. It was as if thousands of torches were being thrown at once, setting fire to everything they touched. The ground shook, walls crumbled, towers split in half, the air filled with smoke and ash, the heat so intense that rocks melted and rivers dried up instantly. Sodom, the city that seemed eternal, was being wiped from the face of the earth. The squares that had once been the stage for dances were now furnaces. Banquets were consumed by flames, jewels melted, idols fell from their pedestals. Cries of delight gave way to screams of terror. But it was too late. There was no prayer, no repentance, no escape. The sentence was being carried out before all of heaven. From atop a hill, Lot and his daughters could see what remained of the city. Thick smoke rose from the valley, forming a column that reached the clouds. It resembled a blazing furnace, as later described in Scripture. Lot's heart sank. He did not rejoice in the destruction, but felt the weight of justice. He knew this was the end of an era, the end of a people who had chosen to defy the Creator. The following days were silent. The wind blew through the valley, bringing only the scent of ash. Where there had once been gardens, there was now scorched earth. Where there had been music, there was now only the distant echo of the past. The whole world would hear of what happened to Sodom and Gomorrah. Those cities would become eternal symbols, not only of corruption, but of warning. A landmark in history to remind generations that when man turns away from God and makes wickedness his banner, the result is always destruction. And so, in the hearts of Lot and his daughters, the lesson was engraved. One must never look back when God commands one to move forward. One must never hesitate when the voice from heaven calls, for he who looks back with longing for what God has condemned ends up petrified on the path, unable to move forward toward what was promised.